Welcome to our exploration of one of the most unsettling cases in New Orleans' documented history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you heard the story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. In 1912, New Orleans was a metropolis of stark contrasts. The French Quarter was alive, with gas lamps and wrought iron balconies lining the tiny alleys, music leaking from doorways, and the aroma of Creole cooking filling the air. The city inhabited a precarious equilibrium between European sophistication and the unadulterated energy of the American South, as well as between traditional customs and contemporary advancement. However, beneath this colorful facade, a little butcher shop in the center of the French Quarter on Dauphine Street between Toulouse and St. Peter Streets had become the home of something terrible. Though few people discuss it now, what happened there would have a lasting impact on the history of the city. The majority of records have been actively deleted, hidden away in dusty vaults, or obscured. On a Tuesday morning in October 1912, a client came into Thibodeau Family Meats with the intention of buying their weekly supplies. Run by Gilbert Thibodeau, a quiet guy in his 50s who inherited the business from his father, the store had been a mainstay in the area for almost 15 years. It was an unusually cold morning for early October New Orleans, and the streets were covered in a fine fog that filtered the morning sun into a gentle golden haze. That day, the client, Mrs. Eleanor Winters, a widow who lived on Royal Street 3 blocks away, saw something strange. She would subsequently testify to investigators that the normally spotless store had an odd smell, not of rotten meat, but of something medical and off. The fragrance was harsh and clinical, not appropriate for a butcher shop, and it brought to mind the hospital where her husband had died 2 years earlier. Mr. Thibodeau's attitude was more concerning. As he wrapped her purchase in brown paper, his hands, which were always steady due to their surgical accuracy while using knives, trembled. His eyes moved often to the entrance of the back room, shaded by dark circles. He only replied that business matters had kept him up when she asked how he was feeling. He lacked the courteous interaction he usually had with frequent clients, and his voice sounded flat. At the moment, she paid and walked away, not giving it any thought. The store didn't open 3 days later. This has never happened before. Gilbert Thibodeau took satisfaction in offering vital services to the community and had kept his normal hours even during the yellow fever outbreak of 1905 when many companies closed. The closed windows and the absence of the hand-painted daily specials board that was often displayed on the pavement outside were observed by the neighbors. The next Monday, when the metal grates were still down and secured, Michael Darrow, who had known Gilbert for more than 10 years and owned the nearby haberdashery, called the police. "It's unlike him," Darrow told Officer James Cullen. "In all these years, I've never known that man to take an unannounced day off, let alone nearly a week." For decades to come, New Orleans would be surrounded by whispered discussions about what Officer Cullen found when he forced his way inside the store. The ensuing inquiry would reveal behaviors so troubling that a number of officers chose to request transfers rather than stay on the case. In his private notebook, Captain Robert Marston, who led the inquiry, would later write that the findings challenged the very notion of what we consider human behavior. At first glance, the shop itself seemed normal, according to the official report filed on the 18th of October 1912. The showcase case was empty but spotless, with gleaming glass. Scrubbing had softened the wood on the cutting blocks by a number of hues. There was not even a trace of sawdust left on the floors after they had been scrubbed clean. Things only turned strange when Officer Cullen approached the rear room. The cold storage locker's door was open, which was against health rules that the meticulous Thibodeau would never have allowed. Items that had no place in a butcher shop were hanging on hooks intended for beef sides inside. The report used evasive language to refer to these items as specimens of an anatomical nature, preserved through unorthodox methods. "The contents of the locker defied immediate explanation," wrote Officer Cullen in his report. "And I confess a moment of disorientation before understanding what I was seeing. The specimens seemed to have been arranged in a way that only their collector could understand. Each has a tiny metal tag with unidentified numbers and symbols on it. A trapdoor behind the counter led to the shop's basement, where an even more unsettling scene was discovered. In contrast to the well-kept shop, there was indications of frenzied activity here. On a workbench, tools had been set up with odd accuracy, clamps, knives, and contraptions that looked like modified versions of common butchery tools. The pages of a leather-bound book were strewn with diagrams and handwritten notes in a small, exact hand. The chair in the middle of the room, with its leather head, arm, and leg restraints, was the most worrisome. The floor was equipped with a number of drains that connected to the city's sewer system. With the exception of a number of anatomical charts reminiscent to those seen in medical colleges, the walls were painted a stark white. Not even Gilbert Thibodeau himself could be located. There were indications of a hurried departure from his residential quarters above the shop. Clothes were scattered, and drawers were left open. As though he hadn't slept there the night before he vanished, the bed was made with care. On the kitchen table, a half-empty coffee cup had a thin film of mold growing on it. A little valise that his maid, Martha Wilson, described as the one he used for overnight journeys to see suppliers in the surrounding parishes, appeared to be the only personal item missing. However, Gilbert Thibodeau's careful business ledger showed that he had no deliveries planned for that week. The following Thursday, a farm and street, Charles Parish was scheduled to host the next livestock pickup. In the 15 years that he had run the store, he had never once closed without warning anyone, or left without telling at least one person where he was going. He had no known plans to depart. This was the start of one of the most bizarre investigations in New Orleans history, a case that would demonstrate how completely a person's public image might conceal their inner interests, and how a city could be blind to the evil that was going on within it. Since coming from rural Terrebonne Parish in the 1872nd, the Thibodeau family had enjoyed good standing in the town. The butcher shop was started by Gilbert's father Henri in 1879 after he and his wife Marie and young son had relocated to New Orleans. Henri was a cheerful man with bright cheeks and a loud chuckle, who usually gave large families an extra share and gave credit to families that were having financial difficulties. He frequently attended church socials at St. Louis Cathedral and made significant donations to neighborhood nonprofits, especially the Esplanade Avenue Orphanage. The burial procession lasted 3 blocks when he passed away from pneumonia in 1897 after getting trapped in a wintry storm while bringing meat to an old customer. Out of courtesy, almost all of the quarter's businesses closed for the afternoon. Gilbert, on the other hand, was quite private and reserved. Since he was 12, he had worked with his father, learning the craft but never gaining his father's relaxed demeanor around clients. Although courteous and professional, he shunned the social events that his father had welcomed and kept conversations short. He never got married and showed little interest in the local mothers who periodically brought their eligible daughters to the shop. A monthly meal with his cousin Maurice, a math professor at Tulane University, was the only social interaction he was aware of. Maurice claims that for more than 14 years, these meals were uninterruptedly hosted on the first Tuesday of every month at the same restaurant. Gilbert was not one for conversation, Maurice Thibodeau would later tell investigators. Even as a child, he preferred observation to participation. Our monthly dinners often passed with minimal exchange. I assumed he was simply of a solitary nature, perhaps even shy. In retrospect, I wonder if he viewed these dinners as a necessary maintenance of appearances, a way to seem normal and connected. The business itself wasn't very noteworthy. It was a little shop with a big window that showed the products of the day on beds of crushed ice. On the glass, the name Thibodeau Family Meats was painted in a sophisticated gold script. The white tile walls inside were cleaned every day until they shone. Years of use did not leave any stains on the marble countertop. Clients saw that Gilbert's white apron showed no signs of blood, even on the busiest days. He was renowned for the caliber of his output and the accuracy of his cuts. Restaurants praised his skill to age beef correctly and bought completely from him throughout the quarter. Everything in its proper place was how Mrs. Wilson, who cleaned his living quarters twice weekly, described his habits. Never a thing out of order, never a speck of dust. Most peculiar in a man living alone, but I thought it merely a preference for cleanliness. The only room I was not permitted to clean was his study. He kept it locked at all times, saying it contained business records of a confidential nature. What was found in the basement was all the more unsettling because of this meticulously preserved order. It implied a mind of deliberate purpose and unnerving clarity, rather than one that was chaotic. Entries in the leather-bound book on the workbench went all the way back to 1899, 2 years after Gilbert had taken over the company after his father passed away. The first several pages covered routine topics like supplier details, inventory records, and consumer preferences. However, the entry's content and tone had changed by 1902. With language more suited to a medical journal than a butcher's logs, they took on a clinical tone. Today's experiment yielded unexpected results. Read one entry from March 1902. The application of cold prior to the procedure alters the texture significantly. Must explore further. The preservation solution, Formula C, shows promise but requires adjustment to prevent discoloration of the specimen. These mysterious messages persisted, growing more intricate and specialized. Anatomical drawings with measurements and observations were included on numerous pages. Certain entries made reference to particular dates for the acquisition and processing of specimens. The language used was objective, scientific, and showed no emotion or moral concern for the operations being explained. The most unsettling were the 23 carefully labeled and dated photographs that were found in a locked drawer in the basement workbench. They appeared to be Gilbert's experimental work, and because of their nature, Officer Cullen had to leave the basement to gather his thoughts. Police Captain Robert Marston quickly confiscated these photos and had them locked up at the precinct. They were purportedly destroyed in the 1923 precinct fire, which many today believe was started on purpose to destroy these and other sensitive materials, and they were never included in official evidence. The objects in the cold storage locker, which is usually used to hang sides of beef and pork, indicated that Gilbert's job went much beyond traditional butchering. While some of the items were identifiable as animal parts, others were of questionable origin. According to Officer Cullen's report, anatomical specimens preserved through a method I am not familiar with, arranged with scientific precision. Dr. Lawrence Morgan, a doctor called in to consult on the case, later examined the items and found that the preservation method seemed to be a variation on techniques used in medical schools, but with certain modifications that produced a remarkable degree of preservation and lifelike appearance. A thorough search of the premises turned up no human remains. This information would eventually prove to be important in the inquiry, since police found it difficult to pinpoint the precise offenses Gilbert had committed, if any, in the absence of such proof. The legal case was unclear because there were no victims or remains, but the existence of strange technology and unsettling notebooks indicated very dubious actions. The probe would eventually be degraded and then abandoned as a result of this ambiguity. Cleavers, bone saws, and blades of all sizes were among the typical butcher's equipment at the basement workshop. However, they have undergone minor alterations. Customized finger grips on the handles indicated extended, accurate use. Unusual cutting angles were created by modifying the blades. A leather bag wrapped with velvet contained a set of surgical equipment, the type used by medical specialists. A Dr. Victor Lefebvre had bought these in 1900, according to the manufacturer's records. After more research, it was discovered that Charity Hospital's renowned surgeon, Dr. Lefebvre, had passed away from a heart attack in 1901. Since the doctor's widow stated that his medical equipment had been donated to the hospital upon his death, it was unclear how Gilbert had obtained them. The most concerning questions were those posed by the restrained chair. It looked like a modified barber's chair with leather straps across the chest, across the ankles, and at the wrists. Beneath it was a drain that was attached to the waste system of the shop. An easily cleaned, smooth, non-porous material had taken the place of the chair's original red leather covering. A tiny table that could be swung into place was fastened to one arm, most likely to keep tools close at hand. Customers and neighbors reacted shock as word of the discovery spread. Perhaps strange, but not dangerous, was Gilbert Thibodeau, the man who delivered Sunday roasts and Christmas hams, who knew which cuts each family liked, and who wrapped presents in brown paper with practiced speed, was a part of the fabric of the town. It was incompatible with his public image to consider that this quiet, careful man would have darker tendencies. "I've been buying meat from that shop for 12 years, said Robert Canning, a regular customer who lived on Burgundy Street. "Never once did I suspect anything amiss. Mr. Thibodeau was peculiar, certainly, but aren't we all in some fashion? He knew exactly how thick I like my pork chops cut. He remembered my wife's preference for lamb over mutton. These are not the behaviors of whatever they're suggesting he might be." There were no results from the first search for Gilbert. At none of the stations in the city did any train conductor recall seeing him get on board. He was not listed as a guest at any hotel or boarding house. $4,217, a sizable sum at the time, was in his Merchants National Bank account, but it was unaltered. Before his abduction, there had been no withdrawals. No strange discussions or actions were recorded by his few known contacts in the days preceding his disappearance. It seemed as though Gilbert Thibodeau had just disappeared into the muggy Louisiana air, leaving only unsettling speculation and concerns about what might have happened behind the dignified exterior of his store. A potential lead surfaced 3 weeks after the butcher shop find. On the evening of October 15th, a ferryman working on Bayou Street, John, north of the city, said that he had taken a man who fit Gilbert's description. Emile Broussard, the ferryman who had been interviewed as part of the expanding search, remembered the passenger due to his formal speaking pattern and metropolitan clothes, which were out of character for passengers in that region. The man refused the offered change, carrying a little valise, and paid for passage with a silver dollar. He had explained that he was doing research on indigenous flora for pharmaceutical purposes and had asked to be driven to a distant location where few people went. At the time, the ferryman didn't give it much attention because the bayou was frequented by a wide range of individuals looking for escape or isolation, and many people sought privacy for different reasons. However, his recollection was jogged by the published account of the missing butcher. He kept to himself, Broussard told investigators. Didn't speak except to give directions. Seemed nervous, but not afraid, more like a man in a hurry to get somewhere important. He carried that bag like it contained something precious, clutched it close, never set it down. Detective William Hayes and Officer Cullen traveled to the area the ferryman had mentioned, which was northeast of the city and consisted of a thinly populated area of swampland and scattered towns. They traveled through ever more remote areas, where cypress trees covered in Spanish moss formed a canopy that filtered sunlight into patterns that were dappled on the dark water. Every now and again they came across remote cabins on stilts above the lake, their residents watching the police boat suspiciously. The region was mostly populated by reclusive trappers and fishers, many of whom spoke a dialect that blended English, French, and Spanish into a linguistic mashup that was hard for outsiders to understand. The proprietor, an elderly man called Clarence Dupre, whose family had run the shop for 3 generations, was shown Gilbert's portrait at a modest general store that functioned as a trade station for the neighborhood. "Yes, he came through," confirmed Dupre, studying the photograph through spectacles held together with a wire. "About 3 weeks back. Purchased supplies, coffee, flour, salt, pork, ammunition. Said he was setting up at his family's old hunting cabin. Paid cash, didn't haggle, left heading north on the old logging trail. Seemed to know where he was going, which was odd for a city man." The officers spent 3 days exploring the surrounding swampland after following this lead, negotiating a system of canals that branched and linked in perplexing ways. They found little evidence of recent habitation, but a number of deserted buildings, including previous hunting lodges, trapper cabins, and even an old sugar mill reduced to rusty machinery and crumbling brick. A local trapper came up to their camp just as they were about to give up the quest. He had heard they were trying to find someone who had recently moved to the region. "There's an old cabin about 4 miles east," he told them, pointing toward a cypress grove visible in the distance. "Been abandoned for years. Belonged to a family named Thibodeau, if I recall correctly. Saw smoke coming from the chimney last week. Thought maybe someone had taken it over. Might be your man." After a tough hike through an increasingly dense swamp, they eventually found the cabin, which had evidence of recent living. It was a modest building with a small porch that drooped on one side, made of cypress logs that had been blackened by time. A chilly fireplace had the ashes of a recent fire, and a cast-iron kettle hung over it. On a rough wooden platform that had been used as a bed frame, A bedroll had been spread out. As the store owner had explained, food supplies, including wheat, coffee, and canned items, were arranged neatly in a corner. Gilbert Thibodeau, however, was absent. They did discover his valise, which contained personal belongings like a comb, a razor, clean clothing, and a scaled-down copy of the leather-bound book that was discovered in the store's basement. The entries in this notebook were more intimate than those in his workshop book's clinical notes. It showed a mind struggling with its own identity and the consequences of its interests. "They would not understand the nature of my work," read an entry dated October 14th, the day before his disappearance. "The precision required, the knowledge gained. Society remains unprepared for advancement of this nature. The boundaries between crafts are arbitrary. The butcher, the surgeon, the anatomist, all working with the same materials, merely to different ends and with different levels of acknowledgement. Better to continue in isolation, where interruption is unlikely and judgment impossible. I have been discovered. The work must be relocated. There are people who will recognize its significance. Contact has been made. Arrangements finalized," said the last entry, dated October 18th. Investigators were puzzled by this final line. It implied that Gilbert was not working alone or that he thought others had similar goals to his own. It suggested a network, or at least a partner, who could help him get away and move. However, it was unclear where Gilbert had disappeared to or who these others may be. They had searched the nearby wetlands exhaustively. After he arrived at the cabin, no locals reported seeing him. He seemed to have been engrossed in the scenery. As the weeks stretched into months, with no new leads, the investigation continued, albeit with less vigor. The case was essentially cold by early 1913. The butcher shop's items were taken out as proof, and it remained closed. As if wiping a stain from the city's memory, the building was eventually sold to a furniture maker who completely demolished the inside and eliminated any indication of its previous use. As the years went by, fewer people who recalled the case mentioned it. Details had frequently been inflated or changed when they were mentioned at all. Ghost tours of the quarter still include the false allegation that bodies have been discovered in the walls. Others maintain that Gilbert had been apprehended and quietly killed to prevent public embarrassment, with his body being dumped in wetlands where alligators made sure there would be no traces of it. Although official records did not substantiate either assertion, such embellishments flourished in the absence of a resolution. If it weren't for a finding made nearly 50 years later, long after the majority of people who recalled the initial events had died, the truth about what actually transpired in that Dauphine Street shop may have stayed permanently hidden. A shocking discovery was made in the spring of 1960 by construction workers remodeling a building in the French Quarter that had formerly been a millinery shop next to Thibodeau's butcher shop. They found a sealed compartment, a gap between the buildings that had been walled off on both sides, while tearing out a portion of wall to install new electrical wiring. There was a metal box, the type intended to hold vital documents, inside this concealed gap. It was locked with a padlock that had rusted over the years. There were newspaper articles regarding the Thibodeau case, a small leather-bound book like the ones at Gilbert's cabin and shop, and a collection of letters. Given the building's infamous past, the construction foreman recognized the discovery's possible significance and called the police instead of carrying out the demolition. This journal did not belong to Gilbert, but to a person who only called themselves Apprentice. The entries described a relationship that had started in 1904 when the writer approached Gilbert with a common interest in anatomical studies that went beyond the bounds of convention. The first entries implied a fortuitous encounter at a medical lecture, followed by circumspect discussion that progressively disclosed shared goals and interests. Mr. T was reluctant at first, read an entry from December 1904. He feared exposure, having already established his independent studies. I assured him of my discretion and demonstrated my own technical proficiencies. He agreed to share certain techniques. Our collaboration begins. His knowledge of preservation methods surpasses my own, but my understanding of physiological responses complements his work. Together, we may achieve what neither could accomplish alone. Their collaboration over a number of years was chronicled in later entries. It appears that the author had come to the store after hours, entering through a back entrance that led to the building next door via the same secret corridor where the journal was eventually discovered. This clarified how someone might frequently visit Gilbert without being noticed by nearby residents or patrons, a significant aspect that had baffled investigators who wondered how Gilbert could have carried out odd actions undetected in Coe's, such a tight-knit community. As the cooperation developed, the entries grew more technical and unsettling. Securing specimens and observational sessions were mentioned, wherein reactions to different stimuli were recorded. The author bemoaned the constraints that come with working in an urban setting and proposed moving to a more remote location where they could continue their job without worrying about being discovered. The diary came to an abrupt end in October 1912 with a note, "Discovery imminent. G will depart as planned. I shall maintain watch and recover what materials are possible once the authorities have concluded their search. Our work continues elsewhere. The location has been secured. Arrangements for transport completed. Within a month, we shall resume without the constraints that have limited our progress here." Interest in the long-forgotten case was rekindled by this revelation. After 30 years with the New Orleans police, Detective James Langley, who was about to retire, became personally involved in the case. Due to a combination of professional curiosity and a desire to solve what he saw as one of the department's most intriguing unsolved mysteries, he started gathering information during his off-duty hours. Even though he was not officially assigned to investigate, the case was decades old and technically inactive. This was never just about a strange man with unsettling hobbies, Langley would later write in his unofficial case notes, preserved by his daughter after his death. The evidence suggests an organized pursuit of whatever twisted knowledge Thibodeau was seeking, and if his apprentice is to be believed, this work continued somewhere else, possibly to the present day. The implications are disturbing, not an isolated incident of aberrant behavior, but a sustained, methodical effort that may have evolved over decades. Using the property records of the millinery store where the journal had been discovered, Langley tried to identify the trainee. Since 1912, the building had undergone multiple ownership changes as companies opened and closed in response to the quarter's shifting economic conditions. In 1919, when many local businesses were impacted by the economic crisis, the store itself had closed. The diary entries provided a limited description of a person with medical education, perhaps a student or unsuccessful practitioner, but none of the owners or staff from that era fit the description. Langley found something that was missed in the initial inquiry while looking through historical media articles of the case. A medical supply warehouse in Baton Rouge reported a break-in 3 months before to Gilbert's disappearance. Special preservation chemicals and equipment were lost, but nothing of substantial monetary value was taken. The detective had observed that the theft was unusual. The thief had chosen certain technical things, such as formaldehyde compounds and specialist glassware required for tissue preservation, over easily transportable assets, such as surgical instruments and microscopes. Although the Thibodeau case had never been linked to this occurrence, the nature of the stolen goods and the timing of the incident fit the work Gilbert's diaries indicated. It implied that he was getting ready to expand his activities significantly, maybe in preparation for the move that was noted in the apprentice's journal. Between 1908 and 1912, Langley also discovered accounts of comparable break-ins at hospitals in eastern Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. The same pattern showed up in each instance. Valuables were left unaltered, while specialized tools and chemicals were taken. Investigators were unable to identify the trend at the time since these thefts had happened irregularly, with months separating episodes. However, when arranged chronologically, they showed a methodical collection of resources that would have facilitated the type of testing the journals recommended. Whoever Thibodeau was working with, Langley concluded in his notes, they were methodical, patient, and possessed specialized knowledge. They knew exactly what they needed and how to acquire it without drawing undue attention. This was not impulsive behavior, but calculated preparation for something specific. As Langley pushed farther back in antiquity, trying to figure out how a butcher had learned about anatomical preservation, a subject usually reserved for medical professionals, the trail became colder. Due to fires, floods, or plain carelessness, Many early 1900s records were lost. However, one link surfaced that might provide an explanation for Gilbert's peculiar passions. Dr. Anton Mueller, a visiting medical researcher, had given a series of lectures on advanced preservation procedures and anatomical investigations at Tulane University in 1892. Records from the institution show that these lectures had been contentious, with a number of faculty members taking issue with Dr. Mueller's views and methodology. After 3 sessions, the lectures were canceled, and Dr. Mueller soon left New Orleans due to allegations of unconventional research carried out without institutional permission. Maurice Thibodeau, Gilbert's cousin, was mentioned as one of the attendees for these talks. Given Gilbert's eventual interests, it was likely that Maurice would have shared the information with his reticent relative, even if Gilbert was not listed as being present. This relationship appeared to be important, possibly the catalyst for his odd interests. After Dr. Mueller left New Orleans, Langley searched for him and his writings, but was unable to find him. There were no articles published under his name in the medical journals of the time. He was not recognized as a legitimate researcher by European medical institutions contacted. Like Gilbert, he seemed to have just disappeared, leaving behind the echoes of unsettling thoughts. Langley's informal inquiry took an unexpected turn in July 1961. He learned that Gilbert Thibodeau had bought a tiny piece of land in St. Bernard Parish, some 20 miles outside New Orleans, in 1909 while looking through old property records. The records showed that the property had a structure unsuitable for habitation, probably an abandoned industrial building of some sort, and that this transaction had somehow been missed during the initial investigation, possibly because it was filed under a slightly different spelling of the name Thibault rather than Thibodeau. Driven to the site, which was now overgrown and looked long abandoned, and only reachable by a rutted dirt road that ran through wetlands, Langley was intrigued by this hitherto undiscovered connection. As it turned out, the building was a former slaughterhouse that had closed its doors in the 1892 due to the obsolescence of newer establishments nearer to transit lines. The structure was dilapidated, with windows smashed or boarded over and a partially collapsed roof. Surrounded by lush grass and young trees that had started to recover the area, it exhibited no indications of recent use. Langley looked around the abandoned structure and saw that the bottom level was remarkably intact, despite the main floor being littered with junk and evidence of years of neglect. The entrance to this lower level was sealed by a massive metal door that contrasted with the surrounding worn construction. With a complex lock system that didn't seem appropriate for the deserted building, the door looked to have been manufactured recently. The lock contained scratches that indicated someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to force entry at some point. Langley took pictures of the location and recorded its coordinates in his journal, but he had no formal authority to force access because this was, after all, his own personal research carried out without departmental sanction. He planned to return with the necessary gear and perhaps a coworker who would be ready to help informally. Before he could plan this follow-up visit, Langley got an anonymous call at his house 2 days later. Shortly after 9, he was making case notes after returning from dinner with his wife when the phone rang. "You're looking in the wrong places, detective," said the caller, described by Langley as male with a cultured accent, possibly European. The voice was calm, unhurried, suggesting someone who felt no threat from law enforcement interest. Gilbert's work was merely preparatory. The true achievement lies elsewhere. "I suggest you abandon this line of inquiry. Some knowledge is not meant for public consumption." A custodian of certain traditions. "Good day, detective," was the man's simple response when Langley inquired who was calling. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Although there was no overt threat, it was implied that you should proceed with this research at your own risk. Despite his best efforts, Langley was unable to track down the call due to technological limitations at the time. The operator said that the caller had used a public telephone at the International House Hotel in the business sector, but left before anyone could identify him. Disturbed by this unexpected conversation, which validated his assumption that someone was keeping tabs on his inquiry, Langley called his superiors and asked that the Thibodeau case be formally reopened. They turned down his plea. They noted that the matter was decades old and that there was no proof of any new criminal activity. What was primarily a historical curiosity could not be given resources. Undeterred, a week later, Langley and a former coworker who owed him a favor returned to the abandoned slaughterhouse. He was shocked to discover the site in utter ruin. Only the charred foundations of the structure remained after it had burned to the ground. The basement's metal door was completely gone, as though it had been taken out prior to the fire. The scorched patch contrasted sharply with the surrounding lush greenery, as even the surrounding vegetation had been devoured. After responding to the incident, the local fire brigade discovered nothing that could be saved. Although the official cause was undetermined, the investigator pointed out that the fire seemed to have started in several places at once, which could indicate arson. No suspects were ever named, and no witnesses claimed to have seen anyone in the vicinity before the fire. This event made Langley believe that someone was deliberately hiding evidence connected to the Thibodeau case, someone who had been keeping a close eye on his investigation and knew when he had found the slaughterhouse, someone who had the means to demolish the site entirely when it came under threat of publicity. As he got closer to retirement, Langley put all of his research into a thorough report that explained how his new results related to the initial case. He sent copies to the City Historical Society, the Police Department archives, and his ex-partner, who is now a captain. In the case of his death, he instructed that his daughter receive the copy he retained for himself, which was placed in a safety deposit box at his bank. On the 17th of August, 1961, Langley's retiring dinner was hosted. His co-workers celebrated his 30 years of service with a toast. His commitment and moral character were discussed in speeches. The Thibodeau case and his informal investigation went unnoticed. It seemed to be the end of a long and illustrious career in police enforcement. James Langley perished in what was declared to be an accidental drowning 3 weeks later when fishing by himself in Lake Pontchartrain. Several miles from where his empty boat was found drifting, recreational boaters near the North Shore spotted his remains. Unusual marks on his wrists and ankles were observed by the medical examiner, who explained them away as post-mortem damage from water debris. His tackle box was arranged with remarkable accuracy, and his fishing equipment was found tucked away in his boat. There was never a trace of Langley's personal copy of his report. After being misplaced during a departmental restructuring in 1965 and filed under the incorrect name, the copy that was transported to police archives was found to be water-damaged and mostly illegible just decades later. When many records were destroyed in a 1967 basement flood, the Historical Society's copy was irreparably damaged. According to reports, his ex-partner's copy vanished in 1970 when they moved to a new home. It appeared that the Thibodeau case would eventually be forgotten completely and reduced to a footnote in obscure histories of crime in New Orleans. Darker periods were pushed aside into folklore and ghost stories as the city progressed, welcoming tourists and its reputation for distinctive culture. Then, in 1969, a PhD student called Catherine Marsh was studying the development of anatomical studies in American colleges for her dissertation, which focused on medical practices in the early 20th century. She discovered a sealed envelope containing the words, "Regarding the Thibodeau matter, to be destroyed, unopened upon my death." The executor of Webster's estate had clearly forgotten this directive when preparing the doctor's papers for donation to the university archives while she was looking through the personal papers of Dr. Harold Webster, a well-known New Orleans physician who passed away in 1939. A thorough description of a 1906 meeting between Dr. Webster and Gilbert Thibodeau 6 years prior to Gilbert's disappearance and the ensuing investigation was included in the envelope. Webster described how Gilbert had approached him following a meeting of the medical organization, posing as an amateur student of anatomy and asking for guidance on professional methods. Before long, the topic of discussion had shifted to particular preservation techniques that are rarely employed outside of medical research facilities. "I explained that such methods were restricted to legitimate scientific inquiry," Webster had written. He claimed to be acting on behalf of a research institution, but could provide no credentials. His knowledge of anatomical terms and procedures suggested some formal training, yet his understanding was curiously limited in certain fundamental areas. I declined to provide the information he sought and reported the inquiry to the medical board as a precaution. Webster described Gilbert as a thin man of medium height, with receding dark hair and eyes that never seemed to blink at the expected intervals. More importantly, Webster noted that Gilbert had referred to similar work being done in Philadelphia and Chicago and described a network of like-minded researchers operating independently but sharing their findings through private correspondence. Webster also claimed that Gilbert had hinted at preservation technique advancements that, when fully developed, would revolutionize medical education. Both of these descriptions matched known photographs. Given the apprentice notebook found in 1960, and the enigmatic caller who had alerted Detective Langley, it was suggested that Gilbert Thibodeau was a member of a larger group. It brought up the unsettling idea that whatever practices had been found in that Dauphine Street butcher shop had persisted elsewhere, possibly even growing under the direction of people who were better off and shielded from criticism. This particular discovery was completely overlooked, and Marsh included it in a tiny section of her dissertation, Ethical Boundaries in Early 20th Century Medical Research. The dissertation was not well known outside of academia. Marsh, who herself sought a career in medical ethics, would sometimes bring up the Thibodeau case in lectures to illustrate the necessity of institutional control over research procedures. In the decades that followed, the Thibodeau case reappeared from time to time in anthologies of historical anomalies or mysteries from New Orleans. Although the legends given had little to do with the real events, tours of haunts in the French Quarter occasionally included the former butcher shop as a point of interest. Businesses that catered to the expanding tourism industry were housed in the structure, which evolved to reflect the changing nature of the quarter. Over the years, Thibodeau Family Meats building underwent multiple ownership changes. It represented the quarter's transformation from a residential neighborhood to a tourist destination by acting as a bookstore, cafe, and clothes boutique. Workers found a sealed cavity in a wall next to the location of the cold storage locker in 1982 while renovating the area to become a gallery showcasing local artwork. There was a glass jar with a little key and a handwritten note inside. It said simply, "For those who understand the necessity of our work, the continuation can be found where the waters meet beneath the crescent moon. The key opens the way to enlightenment. We await those who recognize the pattern." It was dated the 15th of October 1912, the day Gilbert vanished. Instead of looking into the matter further, the gallery owner, who was both interested and unnerved by the finding, gave the pieces to the New Orleans Historic Collection. Later, she said, a number of employees had complained about feeling watched or experiencing abrupt temperature dips in specific parts of the building while repairs were underway. Given the building's infamous past, it is still up for debate whether these reports were true occurrences or the influence of suggestion. A curator gave the relics a quick look, cataloged them, and put them in storage with thousands of other objects from the city's history. It was decided that the mysterious letter was either a hoax or a lost and unintelligible reference. They were ignored for almost 15 years, their potential importance going unacknowledged. The key itself was unique. It was small, composed of a tarnished silver metal, and its bow featured a complex design that resembled entwined anatomical forms. According to a 1,995 metallurgical investigation carried out as part of a larger collection survey, the alloy was unusual in the early 20th century and contained materials commonly found in specialist medical devices of the time. The workmanship implied that it was of European origin, most likely Austrian or German. Although the lock that this key was intended to access has never been identified, the link to medical equipment was consistent with other pieces of evidence in the case. The phrase "where the waters meet beneath the crescent moon" was equally mysterious. It might have referred to a spot where two waterways met at a crescent moon phase. But in the swampy terrain around New Orleans, there were many of such locations. One mystery persisted in the midst of these disjointed findings and sporadic inquiries. What happened to Gilbert Thibodeau when he left New Orleans in 1912? Following his disappearance from the Bayou Cottage, no verified sighting of him was ever documented. In Louisiana and the neighboring states, no death certificate was issued in his name. As was the case with abandoned accounts, his bank account was left unopened until 1942, when it was escheated to the state. There were no indications of violence or struggle at the small cabin in the bayou where the authorities had located him. Instead, it appeared as though he had left the area briefly, with the goal of returning. In a 1978 piece for a local magazine, an amateur historian put out one theory: Gilbert had taken on a new identity and moved to a different location to carry on his work. Although no clear links could be found, the report mentioned a number of unresolved instances in various regions of the nation that had aspects similar to the Thibodeau affair. Similar stealing tendencies to Gilbert's disappearance were recorded by a medical supply warehouse in Chicago in 1921. In 1927, a doctor in Philadelphia reported disturbing modifications to cadavers in the storage facility of the medical school. These events, which span decades and thousands of miles, may be coincidental, or, as the article suggested, they may reflect the ongoing activities of Gilbert Thibodeau, or those who shared his interests, moving periodically to avoid detection while refining whatever techniques had begun in that New Orleans butcher shop. In 1934, a building fire in Boston exposed a hidden room containing equipment that newspaper accounts described as similar to those used in medical research, but modified for unknown purposes. An additional possibility, which was never formally examined, relates to Gilbert's journal entry about others who will appreciate its significance. If Gilbert had been a member of a network, as Dr. Webster's account indicated, these associates might have helped with his disappearance and relocation. The enigmatic caller who alerted Detective Langley almost 50 years later pointed to continuing operations, implying that whatever group Gilbert was a part of had continued to operate long after he may have passed away. Detective Langley's notes produced the most unsettling theory. He had surmised that he might have been killed by Gilbert's trainee to keep their joint operations hidden. The apprentice's notebook had, after all, ended abruptly with a reference to continuing their work elsewhere. It is possible that Gilbert himself was not included in this continuation, as he may have outlived his usefulness once his location was revealed and his methods were learned. Regardless of the facts, the morbid butcher of New Orleans case continues to be one of the most mysterious periods in the intricate history of the city. The surviving pieces, journals, letters, witness statements, and tangible artifacts indicate a troubling combination of medical experimentation and butchery carried out by a person whose apparent normalcy concealed severe internal abnormalities. The prospect that Gilbert's job continued somewhere else, beyond of investigators' reach, possibly even to this day, is perhaps the most unsettling part of the case. Rather than what was found in that Dauphine Street store, somewhere, the methods honed in that workshop in the basement changed, adjusted, and possibly even accomplished whatever their practitioners wanted. The census records from 1920 show a Gilbert Thibault, with the spelling changed, as a medical supply dealer in a small northern Minnesota town. This is the last, intriguing addendum to this odd case. This person, who was 63 at the time, fit the basic description of the missing butcher: medium height, dark hair that was thinning, and no family. In 2002, a researcher looking into the case visited local historical groups and discovered little information about this person. He reportedly remained to himself, lived in a modest home on the outskirts of town, and passed away from pneumonia in 1926. He was buried in the local cemetery, according to church records, but no headstone with that name could be found when the researcher went there. According to town records, the modest home he had lived in was destroyed in 1947 to create space for a business complex. Neighbors noted unusual modifications to the basement before to its collapse, including a sophisticated drainage system, strengthened walls, and specialized ventilation. After dismissing these as the peculiarities of an elderly guy, the new owner demolished the property without conducting any additional research. It is still unknown if this Gilbert Thibault was the missing butcher of New Orleans. Although suggestive, the correlation of name, age, and odd home changes is not definitive. He had made the journey of more than 1,000 miles to start a new life, picked a career that would allow him to access medical services, and spent his days in quiet obscurity, if that were him. Therefore, even if there hasn't been an active inquiry for decades, the case is still open technically. The documents accumulate dust in archives, where they are periodically analyzed by historians or fans of true crime who are looking for trends in the less well-lit areas of the city. The majority of people who hear the narrative reject it as being over the top or fabricated, a story that became more dramatic with each telling until it hardly resembled real occurrences. There is no doubt that in 1912, something beyond the realm of common sense happened in a tiny butcher shop on Dauphine Street, which led to the exodus of a well-respected business owner and left behind evidence of behaviors that were difficult to explain, something that might have gone unnoticed by the public or under formal inspection elsewhere. One aspect of the case is still quite disturbing to those who have researched it thoroughly. A little notebook with what looked to be a list of names and dates was one of the objects cataloged during the initial examination. Investigators were unable to ascertain the list's relevance at the time. The names did not match Gilbert Thibodeau's known associates, and there was no pattern to the dates. When Detective Langley examined this evidence years later, he discovered a startling correlation. Every date on the list matched a reported disappearance in New Orleans or nearby parishes. The disappearances, which happened months apart and involved persons from various social classes who had no obvious relation to one another, a dock worker, a seamstress, a clerk, a drifter, were unremarkable individuals whose absence might be noticed but not thoroughly examined. The majority of persons on the list were never located. The few whose bodies were subsequently found were categorized as mishap or accident victims. Gilbert Thibodeau and his butcher business have nothing to do with any of them. Although circumstantial, the correlations Langley found were concerning since they pointed to a pattern that was not immediately apparent to those who weren't particularly searching for it. Although the conclusion was obvious, it could not be verified without tangible proof. The full scope of Gilbert's activity could only be inferred in the absence of bodies. Furthermore, without Gilbert himself, there would be no reconciliation, no admission, and no justification for the remarkable departures from typical human conduct that a seemingly normal man had to make. Maybe this is the reason the case still makes people uneasy, not because of what is known, but because of what is still unknown. The questions it poses about what might be hidden beneath the meticulously preserved exterior of everyday life are more important than the answers it offers. In a city renowned for its ornate funeral traditions and respect for the deceased, Gilbert Thibodeau's story serves as a somber counterpoint, a reminder that death should not be only a reason to be remembered. For some, it can just be a process to be managed, a boundary to be worked with, or a transition to be examined. An article about past instances of research carried out without institutional oversight was published in a medical ethics journal in 1968 by Dr. Martin Graves, a retired pathologist. The Thibodeau case was briefly discussed in the paper, which raised the possibility that Gilbert was trying to create better tissue preservation techniques at a time when they were still in their infancy. "The tragedy," wrote Dr. Graves, "lies not only in whatever transgressions may have occurred, but in the possibility that potentially valuable knowledge was lost or driven underground due to the inability of society to channel such interests appropriately. One wonders what might have been accomplished had such technical aptitude been properly directed." Despite its controversy, this viewpoint draws attention to the case's ongoing ambiguity. Was Gilbert Thibodeau just a morbidly obsessed individual, or was he making a distorted attempt to advance human knowledge? Was the nature of his tactics exaggerated by time and the accumulation of rumors, or were they as sinister as the equipment that was found suggested? The French Quarter is still alive and well. Visitors walk down Dauphine Street, oblivious to what once happened in a long-gone store. New Orleans welcomes its reputation as a haunted city, transforming historical tragedies into thrilling stories for tourists. Buildings where horrible things are said to have happened are indicated by guides. Some of the stories are meant to make you gasp, not think. However, some tales defy this change. Not all histories can be reduced to mere amusement. The morbid butcher case is still obstinately unclear. It hasn't been totally disclosed or forgotten. A journal entry here, an odd key there. A name in census records that might or might not be the solution to a mystery that started in a butcher shop more than a century ago. It endures in bits and pieces. Perhaps the true nature of Gilbert Thibodeau's work is waiting to be discovered somewhere where the waters meet beneath the crescent moon by those who have the key to enlightenment. Or maybe, for the sake of public comfort, it is preferable that some doors remain permanently locked. some mysteries unsolved, and some knowledge unrevealed. Workers found a locked compartment in the sub-basement level of an ancient Philadelphia hospital that was being renovated into opulent apartments in 2010. Artifacts found within indicated that it had been utilized as a private laboratory at some point during the 1,920 seconds or 1,930 seconds. A leather-bound journal with notes on preservation methods written in a small, exact hand reminiscent of Gilbert's writings was one of the objects found. There was only one statement in the last entry, dated 1,937. New Orleans was merely the beginning. Outside of local publications, the finding was not widely publicized. Another piece of a story that started in a Dauphine Street butcher shop and might not be finished yet. The journal and other materials were moved to a university archive where they are now cataloged, but mainly unstudied. Because there will always be people who are curious about things, regardless of the limits society sets, in the dark recesses of human inquiry, where curiosity surpasses ethical restraint. Furthermore, it becomes increasingly challenging to distinguish between acceptable inquiry and transgressive fixation in a world of growing specialization and technical innovation. The tale of Gilbert Thibodeau serves as a reminder that the most unsettling monsters are not otherworldly things who lurk in the shadows, but rather people whose exterior normalcy belies interior landscapes that are beyond our comprehension. We see the surface, the calm neighbor, the trustworthy store owner, the lonely person who keeps to himself but always nods courteously when passing. Seldom do we get a peek of what's underneath.